Hello, welcome to the Montana Historical Society Foot Locker to learn a new way. What is a treaty? I am Mrs. Rost. I'm the 2020 Montana Teacher of the Year. And today for this lesson, you will need a notebook or paper, a pencil to write with, and a word map if you have it. If you don't have the word map, that's okay too. So today, in this lesson, we will be learning about treaties, reservations, and allotments of Montana American Indians. And we're going to be focusing on these four words: promise, guarantee, nation, and treaty. So as we go through our readings, I want you to focus on finding these words in the readings, and specifically the word treaty. We're going to try to figure out what that word means to us and to American Indians in Montana. When newcomers to this country first arrived, they simply began settling in the coastal areas near their places of arrival. Indian people watched them and at times made contact with them. There was no formal arrangement for taking land to occupy, and later on, this created conflicts and sometimes war. After the colonies evolved into a country with a formal government, they began to deal with Indian tribes through treaties. Treaties are formal agreements between nations. Indian tribes were recognized as distinct nations because they occupied specific homelands, had distinct languages, traditions, and governments. As more settlers moved into Indian lands, the young United States government negotiated treaties with Indian nations because the government recognized that the land belonged to different tribes. The first treaty made with Indians by the United States government was in 1778. The treaty period lasted until 1871, and it created most of the Indian reservations in existence today. By the year 1871, 6 reservations had been established in Montana through treaty negotiations. The 7th reservation, Rocky Boy Reservation, was established by executive order in 1916. Many people have a common misunderstanding that the government gave Indian people land through their treaty negotiations. This is not true. Tribes had occupied large homelands for thousands of years, and in their treaties, they gave up some of this land and reserved a fraction of their original homeland for their reservation. Some tribes had already been displaced by the time of the treaty period, and so they reserved new lands in place of their original homelands. A list of the state's reservations and tribes are shown here. So here is a list up in the top left corner of the different reservations and what tribal groups they are occupied by. And then we have a map of Montana, and you can see the areas where these tribes exist and where the amount of land that each of the tribes have. And we'll be looking at this map more in a little while. So next we need this word map, and we're going to look at the word treaty and determine what it means. If you don't have this word map, then you can just follow along with me. I'm going to zoom into the top part of the word map so we can see it better. So in the middle circle, that's where we're going to put our word. The word that we're looking at is treaty. So we can write that word in the center. And then we're going to move to number 2. Number 2 right below in that rectangle is a sentence or phrase from the text. If you're doing this with me, you can choose any sentence or phrase from what we just read, and you can rewind the video to find the phrase that you think best explains treaty. Here's the sentence that I chose. I found in the reading that treaties are formal agreements made between nations. But you might have found another sentence to show what a treaty is. Then I'm going to move to number 3, and that's the square to the left of the circle. Number 3 is a matching dictionary definition. So I looked up the definition of what a treaty is. I found that a treaty is a formal agreement between 2 or more groups. And then I moved on to number 4. I wanted to know what some synonyms were for the word treaty. What are some words that mean the same thing as treaty? So you can think about what words you might add in here. These might be words from your sentence or from your definition. And these are 2 words that I found that are synonyms for the word treaty. contract or agreement. So if we have a contract or an agreement with someone, that would be similar to having a formal treaty. Now we're going to look at number 5, which are antonyms of treaty. And so these would be the opposites of treaty. And you can think about what words you might put in that box. The word that I thought was the closest to an opposite for treaty was refusal. So if two groups are not working well together, they might be refusing to work with each other and they might not be able to make a treaty. And then in box 6, we're looking for other forms of the word. What are some other ways that we saw the word treaty in the reading? So you can think about how you might have seen the word treaty in the reading. And this is one way that we saw it. We saw it written as treaties. That's another form of the word treaty, and that's when we have more than one. Those are plural treaties. Now we're going to move on to the next part of the word map. So the bottom here is number 8 and number 7. I'm going to do number 8 first. And I decided to write my very own sentence to show that I understand what the word treaty means. So you can take a moment and write down what you think a sentence would be for the word treaty. And then I'll show you mine. So here's my sentence. I wrote, the treaties that the settlers made with Indian nations took much of their land away and made them move to reservations. So that might be similar or different to the sentence that you wrote, but I wanted to make sure that I was understanding the reading and I was understanding what was happening. In the last box, number 7, that's a place for you to draw a picture. So in that box, I want you to draw something that shows that you understand what a treaty is. So it might be a sketch of something, it might be an example or an association with the word treaty. What does this word mean to you? So take a minute to draw in that box or draw on your piece of paper what the word treaty means. Now I'll show you what I drew. I drew a handshake. I didn't draw it. So my association was a handshake. And I want you to think about the sentence above that I wrote and this picture of the handshake. And do you think that those mean the same thing? Do you think when these treaties were being accepted by these Indian nations and their land was taken away, do you think that they were in agreement with this? Do you think this is what they really wanted? And do you think that it could best be symbolized by a handshake? Or is this maybe a symbol that more represents the definition of a treaty, a formal agreement between two groups or two nations? So we're going to take some time and reflect on that with this question. So now in your notebook, I want you to reflect and write about this question. On the bottom right, we have a picture of the reservations in Montana that were established because of treaties or other acts, laws. And I want you to think about this question. Describe how you think Native Americans felt about signing treaties to take away their homelands and move them to reservations. How would you feel? So you can pause the video here, and I want you to sit down and write about this question. So now we're going to continue reading about these treaties after you finish that question. Confining Indian people to reservations was the government's answer to the conflicts over land. However, officials were still unsettled about the presence of Indian people and desired to see them become more like Americans. The government wanted Indian people to change their beliefs, culture, and lifestyles to be more like European Americans. Many people believed that Indian people should give up their traditional way of living and become ranchers or farmers. So now I want you to pause again in your notebook or on your piece of paper and reflect on this question. Describe how Indian people would have felt when the Americans wanted to change their beliefs and culture? How would you feel? You can pause the video now and reflect on this question. And we'll continue reading about these treaties. To encourage Indian people to do this, the US legislature passed a law called the Dawes Act in 1887. This law divided reservation lands into individual allotments for tribal members. These allotments were pieces of land that would belong to individual tribal members. The government thought that if Indian people had their own piece of land, they would be more likely to begin living as a rancher or a farmer. People also thought that this change in the lifestyle of Indian people would make them more like white people. Indian adults with families received 160 acres, and unmarried tribal members over the age of 18 received 80 acres. These allotments were held in trust for 25 years. Trust land meant that the U.S. government was responsible in some way to watch over it. Indian people could not sell their land while it was in trust, and there were no property taxes that had to be paid on it during this time. At the end of 25 years, people could ask to have their land taken out of trust, and often when they did, the property taxes on the land grew to beyond what the owner could pay. Then someone could take the land simply by paying the taxes owed on it. Some Indian people used their land to borrow money or to buy things they needed at trading posts or stores. If they could not pay for loans or the goods, their lands were sometimes taken as payment. Lands that were not allotted, assigned to individual Indian people on some reservations were declared surplus. Surplus meant leftover, unused, or unneeded. These lands were opened up to white settlement, even though there were promises in most of the treaties, like the following guarantee in the 1855 Treaty of Hellgate with the Salish, Penderal, and Kootenai tribes. All which tract shall be set apart, and so far as necessary, surveyed and marked out for their exclusive use and benefit of said confederated tribes as an Indian reservation. Nor shall any white man, excepting those in the employment of the Indian Department, be permitted to reside upon the reservation without permission of the confederated tribes and the superintendent and the agent. Article 2, Treaty of Hellgate. So now I want you to take a minute again and reflect in your notebook. What would you do if the U.S. government broke their promise in the treaty and started giving land to white people? So in the bottom right, you can see that Treaty of Hellgate that I just read from Article 2, and I'll show you more of that later. So I want you to pause and write about what would you do if the U.S. government broke their promise in the treaty. So now we'll continue reading about these treaties. Tribes did not give permission for their reservation lands to be opened up to white settlers. Tribal leaders protested, and some of them traveled to Washington, D.C., hoping that government officials would give attention to their protests. The government went ahead with white settlement of the Crow, Blackfeet, Fort Peck, and Flathead reservations. Between 1889 and 1991, 12 million acres were lost. By 1934, over 2/3 of reservation lands in the United States left tribal control. On the Flathead Indian Reservation, 70% of the tribe's reserved lands was lost to white homesteaders, town sites, reservoirs, and 18,521 acres were set aside for a national bison range. Before the Allotment Act, tribes were already farming and ranching. Many Indian people were making a fairly good living off the land. Indian agent Richard Lansdale remarked on the Penderall farming efforts. Their crops in 1856 were so abundant as to supply much of their food. In 1887, the first purpose of allotment was to support Indian farms and ranches. Later, as the law was applied to other reservations, it was an excuse and method for non-Indians to take tribal lands. The next table that we'll look at of Montana's Indian reservations today are showing the tribe's acreage in the beginning of the reservations and then after the Allotment Act. Many tribes are now buying back tribal lands, so the percentages will be frequently changing. So in this table, you can see the different reservations and their total acreage and how much of their lands have changed hands and still remain in them. So you can see the percent of trust lands changing over time after the Allotment Act. So I want you to now pause and write in your notebook, how did the amount of land that tribal nations had change over time according to this table? Here again is the Treaty of Hellgate. And you can see that that same quote that we just looked at is here again. And it does say in these sentences that the land would not be given to white men, and that if it was, it would have to be with the permission of Confederated tribes, the superintendent and the agent. And you can see from what we learned here today that that is not what happened. And these treaties were broken and given to white men without the permission of the Confederated tribes. So finally, here to end our time today, I want you to pause and reflect on this question and write about it in your notebook. Did the US government uphold the promises in this treaty and other treaties? Did they treat the Indian nation like they should have treated another nation? Why do you think this happened? Thank you very much for spending this time today with me on this lesson, and I hope you learned more about treaties and how they impacted American Indians in Montana. I'll see you next time.